Hello, everybody, and welcome to this afternoon's presentation by Kate Douthit on vascular plant community assembly and stormwater detention basins. Kate started to think about coming into ecology and evolution back in 2016. We had some really interesting conversations, and I just thought she'd be a lot of fun to work with. And I was right. I could not have predicted what her topic turned out to be. And one of the things I think you'll see as she talks about it today is her interest and enthusiasm in a lot of different directions about plant community structure. And I think that it will serve her well in the future. I'm very pleased to thank her committee members, Mary Lack, Marcy Mixler, and Mila Aronson for helping us through this process so effectively. And I will turn it over to Kate, who I'm sure will keep you interested for the next many minutes.
Thanks, Jean Marie. So because I'm presenting to both an in-person audience and Zoom, I'm going to turn off the Zoom camera because you really don't need to see me during the presentation, and then I'll turn it back on at the end for questions. Okay. Okay, a stormwater detention basin is a form of artificial urban wetland and a useful study system for learning about wetland communities. Though the plant community plays an important role in providing both ecosystem services and disservices in stormwater infrastructure, there's been no field research documenting the plant communities there. So in my dissertation research, I aim to gain an understanding of the species pool and diversity trends, develop a mechanistic model of plant distribution in stormwater detention basins, and then I tested a restoration method for basins dominated by invasive species. I conducted this research across 3 field seasons, and my research program included observational studies at 2 scales and a seedling addition experiment. In this presentation, I'll review the role of stormwater infrastructure and a little bit of the history, and then I'll present my goals, methods, and results for my 3 chapters. So first of all, there are over 20,000 stormwater basins in the state of New Jersey alone, and we're the 4th smallest state. So if you multiply that over the entire United States, you get the idea that there are a lot of stormwater basins and stormwater infrastructure. So this is a very important urban form. Stormwater runoff is the water that comes from rainstorms and then hits an impervious surface, such as a road, a roof, or a parking lot, and then runs into a storm drain. In areas with a lot of impervious surface, rain can't infiltrate into the ground, and runoff would lead to flooding or standing water if it weren't channeled away. The way the stormwater system works is that the water that hits one of these surfaces runs into a storm drain, enters the storm sewer, which then lets out in the closest water body. Historically, the purpose of the stormwater sewer system has been to move a large quantity of water away from buildings and roads as quickly as possible. One of the problems with this system is that these large pulses of stormwater, when they enter a water body like a stream, they can cause this flooding because there's so much more water than the stream has been used to holding, and then you get these sorts of problems. So the first kind of goal of a stormwater basin is to reduce the quantity of water that's being pulsed into downstream systems. The stormwater detention basin design is meant to hold stormwater and release it slowly into the receiving waters. And it's typically an earthen structure that's either excavated or built up with a dike to hold the water back, and water drains slowly through an outlet pipe over the course of a few days. This is what a conventional stormwater detention basin might look like, with the water entering at the inlet, flowing through, and then leaving through this outlet structure. And this is an example of a conventional style of stormwater basin that's lined with turf grass. Next, in the general evolution of stormwater infrastructure, there was an awareness that this water rushing over roads and fertilized lawns was picking up a lot of contaminants on the way. So water quality became both an environmental and regulatory target for stormwater. So the next function that got added onto stormwater basins was water quality improvement. Now, another 20 or 30 years later, New Jersey has, and nationally, there's a next generation of stormwater infrastructure with a big movement toward using green infrastructure. Green infrastructure filters and absorbs stormwater in place where it falls, and the definition includes the range of measures that use plant or soil systems or other permeable substrates to store, infiltrate, or evapotranspirate water and then reduce the flows to sewer systems or surface waters. So the conventional style of stormwater infrastructure doesn't really qualify or meet a lot of the updated rules. So many of the older detention basins will need to be renovated. And as we move forward with building stormwater infrastructure and green infrastructure, we'll need to know more about the plant community. Here are 4 examples of existing vegetated stormwater detention basins. So these might be considered more of a green infrastructure approach, where they still have the same inlet and outlet setup, but instead of turf grass, we have this mixed plant community. So this is the type of basin that I've been studying in my research. Using green infrastructure offers a lot of opportunities for reducing downstream flows, improving water quality, and additional functions such as creating wetland habitat for biodiversity in the urban landscape. However, a vegetated stormwater basin is an ecosystem that will grow and change over time and won't necessarily conform to the vision established by designers. These ecosystems have a life of their own, and anyone who has ever had a garden is familiar with weeds, plants that die. Some plants are more successful than others. And despite the large amount of infrastructure out there and strong green infrastructure, there has not been any scientific monitoring of the actual plant community in stormwater basins. So part of the reason that this research is important is before we go really full scale into renovations and green infrastructure, we need a better idea of the reality on the ground in these plant communities. The initial questions of my research were to establish the species pool and dominant species, the community patterns, and then the drivers of those patterns. And understanding these factors can inform future design practices and the types of additional functions that stormwater detention basins can provide. So my first research chapter addressed these questions directly. And one of the drivers of patterns that I was looking at was the influence of landscape setting. So I wanted to know if landscape influenced the types of plant communities I saw, or if there was some other type of grouping independent of landscape. I looked at 15 detention basins in Middlesex and Mercer County. And here we are at Cook campus. So these sites are local to the Rutgers region. And I looked at five sites in parks, which are these green dots, and then 10 along the highway, which are my roadside sites. At each site, there was a detention basin, and I sampled the vegetation community for abundance in the form of aerial cover, and then the species identity, the composition. And I did that along these belt transects that were divided up into quadrats. One transect spanned from the inlet to the outlet, and then 3 additional transects spanned perpendicular at the inlet, the outlet, and the midpoint. And this just gives you an idea of what it looked like when we were out there setting up our transects. So the first thing I found here was the dominant species at road site. So I'll show you the dominant species at each site, and you'll see there's quite a bit of repetition. So at these 10 sites, the most common species were cattails type of species and Phragmites australis, the giant reed grass. And then there were a few additional species at select basins, including this 3-corner sedge, purple loosestrife, bittersweet, nightshade, and soft rush. The park sites had some overlap, but also a more heterogeneous mix of dominant species, including mugwort, cattails, spotted smartweed, woolgrass, purple loosestrife, and heath aster. As a group, all combined, cattails were by far the most abundant species, and they were found at 14 out of 15 sites, which was 93% of sites, and had a relative cover of 26%. And can you make sure that your microphone is muted because someone is wrestling? Thank you so much. Giant reed grass, Phragmites australis, had a similar level of cover at almost a quarter of total quadrats sampled, but were only found at 50% of sites. And then the next 3 species experienced quite a drop off in abundance. They were only accounted for 4 to 7% of total cover, but were relatively frequent, found at between about 50% and 2/3 of sites. These top 3 species by cover are all invasive, although woolgrass and soft rush, as well as many of the subordinate species, were native. Overall, I found 126 unique taxa, including species and genera. And on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 indicating the most disturbed and 10 indicating the most high quality wetland habitat, they had a mean coefficient of conservatism of 2.9. So that indicates a generalist habitat. About 15% of species were woody, and the remainder were herbaceous, mostly forbs and graminoids. 71% of species were native, 13% were classified as invasive in New Jersey, and then another approximately 16% were introduced. So not native, but not reaching the threat level of an invasive species. About 81% had a perennial life cycle, and then another 20% were exclusively annual or biennial. And then species were about 50-50 obligate or facultative wetland species, and then the other half were upland to facultative. So that does indicate quite a large proportion of wetland species. Looking at the difference between park sites and roadside sites. You can see the trend is to have fairly similar characteristics across some of these different measurements. And according to a Permanova, there was no significant difference in species composition between the two types of sites. Since I didn't find a significant difference between park and roadside sites, I looked for other potential types of clusters in these sites. So I used a hierarchical cluster analysis to create this minimum of 3 site types by species composition and abundance. And then I used Permanova on these clusters to also test if these were significantly different groupings. And what I found from the cluster analysis is that this first cluster was significantly different from the other 2, but then clusters 2 and 3 were not significantly different from each other. So essentially I had 2 site clusters by species composition. This cluster 1 was characterized by Phragmites australis, and then the other 2 clusters were very heterogeneous with a lot of different species, but the most representative species of this group was purple loosestrife. Cattails was not characteristic of either group because it was so common in all sites. So for this first data chapter, I found that cattails and Phragmites australis are dominant, but overall there's a lot of heterogeneity both within basins and among basins. I found that this was a very generalist type habitat with high invasive cover, and that landscape setting was not a strong driver of composition, at least in my small sample of sites. So then the next question was, if the landscape wasn't driving strong differences, what else would account for differences in basin communities? So for my next chapter, I scaled down to look at what was going on in individual basins. And I wanted to look at hydrology because hydrology drives species distribution in wetlands very generally and can be characterized by the 3 factors of flooding depth, duration, and frequency. And hydrology is also mediated by topography. So at higher marsh elevations, it'll be drier, just experience less flooding, and then at lower elevations, experience more flooding. And this drives these important differences in different types of communities. So stormwater detention basins can generally be located in this scrub to wet meadow through shallow emergent marsh category. Even though there's not supposed to be standing water, according to the designs, I did often find standing water over my boots. So it's an important issue. And in this next chapter, my questions were, is the plant community determined by hydrology? Are there characteristic habitat zones? And is cattail distribution determined by hydrology? The site where I conducted this study was a residential community, and I looked at 8 detention basins there. One of the advantages of using this site was that the whole community, including the basins, were built at the same time in 2003. The basins are very close geographically and have the same types of maintenance regimes. So as close as possible, this was a controlled system compared to the regional sample in which the basins were all different ages and maintained by different entities. At this site, I chose 4 basins with cattails and then 4 without, so that I could assess the range of hydrology conditions associated both with cattails and with other types of communities. In the measurements that I took were similar to my previous study. So I used these transects from the inlet to the outlet, and then every 10 meters to gather the abundance and plant species composition. And then I took measures of hydrology. I took soil moisture measurements at each end of the two of the quadrats. And then we took these measurements twice during the growing season, once in July and once in October. And then those 4 points were averaged to give us a soil moisture measurement for each quadrat. I also looked at topography because it's related to hydrology. So I measured elevation every meter in each quadrat. And then those elevation points were averaged to give elevation per quadrat. And then I could also calculate slope. And this is just a little idea of what some of these transects looked like when we were going through the cattails. I took the data that I gathered and I made 3 types of models. One was to look at species richness, so the number of species per quadrat. And then the next was the distribution of all species along the hydrologic gradients. And then lastly, I looked at individual dominant species and their response curves to hydrology. So in this first model, I used logistic regression to assess the relationship between soil moisture percentage and species richness. And this blue line represents the modeled relationship, and the gray is the 95% confidence interval. So what this shows is that species richness peaks at around 55% soil moisture in this community, although it maintains a broad hump from the minimum measured values through to almost 100% soil moisture saturation, at which point species richness drops off quite a bit. The pseudo R-squared value for this model was 0.149. So this indicates that soil moisture explains about 15% of the variation in species richness that we see in this community. In this next model, which is canonical correspondence analysis, the figure shows the relationship of the quadrats, which are these black circles, the species, show the red crosses, and the moisture gradient and elevation gradient. What I can start to learn from this figure is that the quadrats are clustering in a few places. So on the wet end of the soil moisture gradient, there's one cluster of quadrats. In this lower elevation, drier area, there's another cluster of quadrats. And then at a higher elevation and drier area, there's another cluster. However, the species don't cluster quite as cleanly, and the hydrology measurements only explain about 11.6 of species distribution. Looking at this distribution, though, we do see that there are very few species in this wet area, and our old friend cattails is one of the, or is the most abundant species in this area. And then in this higher elevation, drier area, there's 2 most abundant species, which are mugwort and American senna. And then down in this lower elevation, drier area, the community was dominated by New York ironweed. So those 4 species were the most abundant species throughout the 8 basins, and they represent roughly the different areas, the different quadrants of the ordination. I also looked at this shallow sedge because it was very frequent in the community, although at low abundance, but it is kind of neutral in the middle of this hydrological gradient of soil moisture and elevation. So I took these 5 species and I used logistic regression to estimate the probability of occurrence for each species according to the soil moisture level in each quadrant. So elevation was only significant for New York ironweed, but not a significant predictor for the occurrence of any of the other species, though soil moisture was a significant predictor for all the species. Cattails had a 100% probability of occurrence under saturated conditions. So at 100% soil moisture and above, this model predicts that it will be found in every single quadrant. However, the other species only had about a 50% probability of occurrence at their hydrologic niche optima. These are the pseudo R-squares for these models. And this gives us an idea of how much soil moisture alone, and in the case of New York ironweed, soil moisture and elevation, how much of their occurrence is explained by these variables. So for cattails, about 63% of their occurrence is explained by soil moisture alone, but for the other species, between 5 and about 17% of occurrence is explained by hydrology. So in this chapter, I found 3 general habitat zones defined by soil moisture and elevation. I found that cattail occurrence is largely determined by soil moisture levels, but that other species are only weakly determined by hydrology. Because hydrology was a weak predictor for many species, that leaves the question still of what are the main determinants of species distribution in stormwater detention basins. Also, because cattails are so frequently found, but also so inevitable in the saturated zone, there's a question of how can we limit their populations and restore invaded areas. Cattails can be invasive. There's a native species, but there's also an invasive hybrid, which invades many natural wetlands. So stormwater detention basins actually provide an opportunity to do some experimentation about what types of restoration practices might be effective in both stormwater detention basins, but also natural wetlands. Biotic interactions are important to consider, and they can have a large effect on species distribution. So in this next chapter, I mostly am considering competition, in which all species involved are negatively affected, facilitation, in which all species involved are positively affected, or neutral, in which there's no interaction. In this chapter, I tested a co-occurrence theory offered by some authors, and I'll talk more about that in the next slide. But 2 questions that came out of that were whether co-occurrence in natural wetlands predict facilitation among seedlings, and whether co-occurrence in natural wetlands predict better competition with cattails. In addition to testing this question, I wanted to know what is the relative importance of the hydrology on one hand and the biotic interactions on the other hand for wetland species growth. So there's a lot of research on invasive cattails, especially in the Great Lakes region. And one of the papers that came out of that body of work is this paper by Johnston and Zedler from 2012. In this paper, they propose that analyzing naturally occurring plant communities can provide a list of associated pairs of species, which would help focus revegetation efforts on the species that are most likely to establish. They evaluated wetland data from the Great Lakes region to identify what they call preferential associates, which are species that co-occur more frequently than expected based on their overall abundance. And Johnston and Zedler provide guidance on how to initiate restoration with preferential associates. I thought this was a very interesting idea, but no one had tested it in the literature. So in this chapter, I used this idea to do a seedling addition experiment in a stormwater basin. So the first thing I had to do was collect a regional data set of natural herbaceous emergent wetlands from which I could select these preferential associates. So I used existing data sets and combined them. And these data sets all had species at a quadrat level. So I was able to get a fine scale of co-occurrence data. And from that data set, I calculated co-occurrence statistics to determine the frequency of co-occurrence for these pairs of species. And then the pairs with the higher than expected co-occurrence were termed preferential associates. This figure shows the results of the statistics, and the pairs in blue had positive relationships, meaning they were found together more frequently than you would expect. And the orange pairs had a negative relationship, so they were found less frequently than you would expect. And then everything in gray co-occurred approximately within the range that you would expect by random chance. So I use these statistics to select 6 species in 3 pairs of preferential associates. And then I made 3 types of neighbor treatments. So the first one was the preferential associate. The second treatment was non-preferential associate. So I took the same 6 species and then mixed them and matched them so that they would be planted with a species that was not a preferential associate. And then the third treatment was a single species treatment that would provide a control and a baseline for the survival and biomass of each species without interspecific interactions. So the site that I chose was already dominated by cattails, and leaf litter is a major barrier to biodiversity in sites dominated by cattails. So when I prepared the site, I cut down the existing cattails and raked off as much of the leaf litter as I could. Then in the experiment, I tested for biotic interactions, so facilitation in my preferential associate treatment, potentially competition with both cattails and the non-preferential associates. And then, especially because we already know hydrology is important, I included hydrology to compare the relative strength of biotic and abiotic interactions. In this experiment, I planted 144 plots in these 10 plant combinations, so either single species or mixed species, and they're planted in 6 blocks. So the first 4 were all symmetrical, and then as the site tapered down, I had to adjust the size, but they contain the same replicates as the first 4 blocks. So the plants grew in this experiment from June until September. And then at the end of September, I counted the survival of each seedling. And then I cut down each seedling and all of the cattails within these 1 meter plots. And then I dried them and weighed them to get the biomass for each seedling in each plot. Also, during the growing season, I measured soil moisture in each plot and the relative marsh elevation of each plot. And then I took all of that data to create a survival model and a biomass model for both the target species, which are the seedlings that I planted, and the cattails. This is what the seedlings looked like after 2 weeks. So that gives you an idea of the size when they started. And even after I cleaned off the litter, there's still all this cattail litter floating around. Then in September, here on the left, this is how much things had grown back. And this is a view of the site looking south. And then here on the right gives you a bit of an idea of how large some of the target species grew to over the course of the season. So, what was the effect of neighbor treatment? First of all, on survival, everything in the 3 treatments survives at about 98%. So there was extremely high survival, and it was not significantly different by treatment. It was also not significantly different by species. And then when I looked at the biomass, I looked at the biomass here in figure A by species. So I looked at the 6 species separately because they all ended up having a different mean biomass. But by species, the X represents the mean, and you can see that there's very little difference between biomass in the single species, the non-preferential, and the preferential treatments. So that neighbor treatment does not seem to have had an effect. And then in figure B, that's just all of the data from all 6 species pooled, and there's even less of a difference in mean when we look at it that way. So we don't seem to be seeing an effect of either facilitation or competition by neighbor treatment. But there are still predictors to look at. So I made a multivariate model, and I used generalized least squares regression, which just assigns a different standard deviation for each species. So that's why in these figures you see a separate line for each species, but they do have the same coefficient from the model as a whole. So I found that the target species biomass was positively correlated with wetter conditions. So here in figure B, biomass is higher at the lower marsh elevations, which tend to be wetter, and biomass was higher in higher soil moisture. And I found that target species biomass was negatively correlated with cattail biomass. So as cattail biomass increases, the target species biomass decreased. And that is a rough representation of competition between the cattails and the target species. For B, C, and then D, the hydrology and the competition had approximately the same effect size. So asking which is more important, they were approximately the same. They had the same effect size on target species biomass. I also found an interaction between marsh elevation and cattail biomass. So what that means is that at higher marsh elevations, so where it's a little bit drier, there's very little change in target species biomass, even when cattails decrease. So what we would expect is that as cattail biomass decreases, we would expect to see target biomass increasing because there's less competition, but it's very flat at the higher elevations. And then as it goes down into the lower elevations, we do see the effect of increasing target species biomass as cattail biomass decreases. And the pseudo R squared was very high for this model, so it does seem to account for many of the important factors in the seedling growth. So the other side of the coin in this study was looking at what was the effect on the cattail biomass. And much like the target species, cattail biomass was not affected by the neighbor treatments. So preferential associates, non-preferential associates, and the monospecies treatments, as well as control plots where only cattails were grown, they all had approximately the same mean and median, no effect on cattail biomass. So then I also made a multivariate model to try to account for what did affect cattail biomass. And there was just a single species for this model, so I just used ordinary least squares linear regression. And I found that cattail biomass was negatively correlated with the target species biomass. So as target species biomass increased, cattail biomass decreased. And I separated that out from the species identity. So this was purely biomass and not related to the species of the target species. Similar to the target species, I found that competition was less important in drier conditions for cattails as well. So there's this lack of response to competition in the high marsh compared to responsive biomass in low marsh. And then lastly, cattails biomass was correlated with the experimental block. So you'll recall that there were 6 blocks, and these blocks were all planted sequentially during 1 week. So it was a fairly short time period. However, each block was, cattails were cut the day before the planting. And so in blocks 5 and 6, cattails were cut down a little bit later. And then the very next day, there was a large storm and the basin was flooded with a meter of water that stayed in the basin about a week. So there was this difference in the timing of the cutting and the flooding, which may have led to this difference that we saw in the end, quite a big difference in the eventual cattail biomass. Cattail biomass, on the other hand, was not directly correlated with soil moisture or marsh elevation. It was only correlated with this potential preparation effect. And this model accounted for about 50% of variation in cattail distribution. And these cattails were already on the site before the experiment, so there would have been some existing differences in their biomass that I wasn't able to account for. So in this chapter, I found that target species had neutral interaction in their first year of growth, so neither facilitation nor competition. I found that competition between cattails and target species was significant, and that competition in hydrology had approximately the same effect size for target species growth, but cattails were not affected by hydrology over the small gradient length. So there wasn't enough difference in the wet and the dry conditions to affect cattail biomass. And then lastly, I found that interaction is that competition may have been less intense in the driest conditions. Driest conditions right here. So those were my 3 studies over the 3 years. So coming back to my initial goals, these were the things I started out wanting to answer. And then I added on a few goals as I learned more about the system. So one of the major takeaways from the study is that cattails are the dominant species in stormwater detention basins, and probably a lot of other young wetlands as well. Though I did find a high cover of invasive species, there was also an unexpectedly high richness of native species. In the species pool, when I compared what I found in my surveys to what I found in the reference data sets that I collected, I found a lot of the regional freshwater wetland species were missing from stormwater detention basins. And here's a few examples that are very common in the region. And then I also found that conditions were too wet for most woody species. So it's a predominantly herbaceous system. Looking at the community patterns and the drivers of these patterns, one of the interesting takeaways was that species, the native species community seemed to be mostly associated with the low elevation areas that were frequently flooded, but then dried out completely between storms. So areas that remained saturated were taken over by cattails, and areas that were never flooded seemed to be taken over by mugwort and some of the more upland invasive species. But the landscape was not a strong predictor of species composition, but hydrology was. And hydrology was extremely predictive of cattail occurrence, up to 100%, which is really remarkable that in their ideal hydrologic range, cattails were found at 100% quadrats. But soil moisture and topography explain only 10 to 15%, depending on the measure we look at, of other species distribution. And comparing cattails on the wet side and the other dominant species that I found on the drier side, as a whole, the dominant species seem to have their niche optima at the extreme ends of the basin moisture gradient. The effects of hydrology and competition were comparable. So they're both important, but they had about the same effect size on seedling growth. And there's this really interesting effect of competition possibly decreasing at higher marsh elevations. Cattail biomass was not affected by hydrology, which was a bit of a surprise. However, the basin conditions are so homogeneous that there doesn't seem to be enough difference in the hydrologic gradient to produce an effect on cattail biomass. And then I found that co-occurrence in natural wetlands, which we might think is produced by facilitation between species, does not seem to be related to facilitation. So you might think that species co-occur naturally because they're helping each other, but my study seems to provide evidence that they co-occur because they thrive in the same abiotic conditions. And then many previous studies have shown facilitation under flooding stress. So in the most frequently flooded areas, there is more facilitation and then more competition in higher elevations. But my study found slightly different results, and it may be because my conditions compared to previous studies are a little bit drier overall, but that's a pretty interesting result that competition actually collapsed under drier conditions in my study. In addition to ecological theory, the information in this study can be applied to basin design and help us kind of make a map for the future use of plants in green infrastructure. In addition to my initial questions, these are some of the kind of questions for practice that I can begin to answer with the information that I found in my research. So I'll just give you a few examples because this is something that we could think kind of extensively about how to apply this information. But a few examples of how this research can be applied is we can use the species lists that I made in my first 2 chapters of actual stormwater detention basin species, and then my species list from the reference sites as a good guide for which plants are and could be successful in stormwater detention basins. And then a few ideas for design tweaks in order to increase species diversity. We also need to increase the abiotic heterogeneity. So in a large flat basin, there's not enough difference in elevation and soil moisture. So one possibility could be to create microtopography. And then for restoration, using co-occurrence to select species appears to be very effective. Even though I didn't find evidence of facilitation, survival was amazing. There, 100% for some species. So whether or not co-occurrence is indicating facilitation, it does indicate a good fit for this environment. So this might be a good method for restoration moving forward. Looking at habitat quality, there's quite a range, and some of the basins, especially the drier ones, did contain a high diversity of native species that could provide forage for pollinators, for example, and this really kind of mirrors the types of efforts to use infrastructure for pollinator habitat, such as the power corridors that is happening in this area. So some of these areas could provide good habitat, but again, it's not going to be a one-size-all solution. Some may be appropriate, whereas other sites are probably always going to be too wet. And as we know, if it's wet, you're going to have cattails. So some sites are just probably not going to be appropriate for native plant vegetation, but wetter sites can host amphibians, macroinvertebrates, etc. So it's actually not a hopeless situation, but each basin is probably going to be more appropriate for different types of taxa. In terms of green infrastructure, we're really asking a lot from green infrastructure. So stormwater basins are actually worse at eliminating non-point source pollution than just stopping it at the source. And flooding and habitat loss is often caused by land use change. So even though there's a lot we can do with these stormwater basins, there's a lot of actions at the systems level that are probably going to be even more effective for reducing runoff. So reducing impervious surface, no new roads, shrink our parking lot sizes, and these types of actions are, kind of the larger context for stormwater. And when you look at green infrastructure, there's this kind of range of approaches, and our vegetated detention basins, they're very similar in their overall functions to natural wetlands, so that's good. But surely preserving existing wetlands and forests is a simpler approach than trying to rebuild or restore wetlands. So I'll leave this though on this hopeful vision of what stormwater detention basins can be. And in the future, I'd like to look at a larger sample of basins from a wider geography And I think a trait-based as well as species-based approach may explain a lot of the taxonomic heterogeneity and patterns observed in the system. Also, stormwater detention basins are disconnected from many wetland seed sources. So a next set of questions that I'd like to address involve seed dispersal and how species are limited by dispersal in these stormwater wetlands. I hope this research will be of theoretical and practical utility. And I do think that I've shed light on an overlooked urban ecosystem, and that this research can provide guidelines for the burgeoning field of stormwater green infrastructure. So just to prove that I was at the sites, not just my helpers, but I did get a lot of help along the way. So there's really more people to thank than I possibly can thank. But everybody who helped me as a field assistant and was out there sweating with me, so a big thank you to all of you and to the funders that help support this research, everyone at Traditions that allowed me to do research on their site, everyone who shared reference data, and my committee members, including John Dighton, who was on my qualifying committee. So thank you so much for your attention, and I can take some questions through the chat, or you can unmute yourself. But I do have to figure out the.
You need help?
I'm working. Okay, so I have a question in the chat. So the question is, since a lot of newer green infrastructure such as bioretention basins emphasize stormwater infiltration rather than just temporary ponding, how do you think your findings might be applied to infiltration systems? So there's a few different factors, I think. I mean, there's many factors. In a successful infiltration basin, the water should be entering the soil and possibly entering the groundwater. So we might anticipate that that type of system would be drier than the ponded system. So in that type of scenario, it actually, we might be seeing this drier palette like the New York ironweed, and that actually might be where we see this more native plant community. On the other hand, I would still anticipate invasive species coming in and leaving a lot of leaf litter. They also help trap a lot of sediments, and so that can lead to system clogging. So I think infiltration systems will actually need really a lot of maintenance to prevent soil surface clogging, because cattails and phragmites, they just mat down so much. So I think that's actually a big concern for infiltration basins, is that the amount of maintenance that will be required might be really high. And Allison, thank you so much for your question and all of your help. Allison helped me with my pilot study in the beginning. Are there any other questions?
I have a question, Kate.
Oh,
you have
yes,
any-
please.
This is Mary Leck. Do you have any thoughts about studying dispersal into these kinds of communities or the development of a seed bank in any of these places?
Sure. Just any thoughts at all, or did you have something more specific in mind?
No, just generally.
Yeah. So this is something that I didn't address directly. So, it's all going to be kind of conjecture. But as I mentioned, there are a number of species that are really common in the natural wetlands that are missing in stormwater detention basins. And I think a lot of those may be water dispersed, and that there's a big hole in the dispersal network because stormwater basins are not connected to the natural water system. They get their runoff from roads, and so there's some other research that has showed certain guilds tend to colonize at different rates. So I think that may be an effect. And then because they're artificial, whatever seed bank is there is going to be probably a lot of, kind of weeds. So the seed bank is going to take a long time to develop. And that could be something that, along with the co-occurrence plantings, it could be important to kind of seed more the seed bank than actually seeding, because you think I'm going to seed it and then everything's going to grow. I think it's a lot more difficult than that, but you could kind of enrich the seed bank at the time of construction. So those are a few types of thoughts.
Thank you. I just wanted to mention that you may have mentioned in your dissertation the possibility of people using seeding as they're doing the construction, but using seed mixes to me seems to be really problematic in and of itself.
Exactly. And that's a lot of where I started with this research, because I don't know what you have in mind, but when you do the seeding, a lot of things, the germination for different species, they need these different requirements, and they're going to germinate probably at different rates and under different circumstances. So you're really not setting up a situation where everything's going to just fill out right away. And so I think what I did in my experiment using plugs, so the seedlings, is much better. Of course, it's going to be much more expensive and labor intensive, but you can actually you can get things started ahead of time a lot better. So another thing that I think would be really interesting is if we could get the original seeding lists for a lot of these sites, it would give us a lot of insight on what is and isn't succeeding. And let's see, I have another question here in the chat where it says it would be interesting to see if any of the commonly found species are especially good at pollutant removal. Any thoughts on that? Yes, absolutely. So another kind of motivation for this research is that there is actually quite a large body of research looking at which plants do the best pollutant removal. So I think part of it, it's great, it's important to understand, but it's also important to understand that just because you think that plant A is what you want, you might not get plant A at your site. So it's really good to understand the range of effectiveness, but that was why part of why I wanted to do this research, is so you could sort of have a better and more nuanced understanding of which species are both effective and likely to succeed. And actually, a lot of research does focus on cattails and Phragmites as being very effective because they have these really high growth rates. They take up nutrients really fast, and they're thick, and they tend to trap sediments. So those actually can be very effective for nutrient removal and pollutant removal. It's complicated though, because a lot of times in the fall, once things die back, it can re-release nutrients, so it can actually become a source of pollutants. So that's one of the reasons why it's not going to be a set it and forget it situation. You might need to harvest the biomass out of the basins. You're probably going to want to set up a way to trap sediment separately because it's going to be so different. You can't just like pick it out from between the plants once it gets trapped. So it's actually, I think there's a lot of potential, but really a lot of problems with this type of system.
I have a question. At one point you said in your conclusions that the basins were too wet for woody species. How do you know it's not just the way the basins are being managed and mowed that are keeping the woodies out?
Yeah. Well, I don't really know, but in a lot of cases, there's not always evidence that they are being managed and mowed with any frequency at all. So sometimes it's just like there seems like there's very infrequent management. And even in basins that are mowed, I'm not even sure what they're doing because I saw in the very driest areas some seedlings growing. So part of it is like it seems like they're not doing a lot of maintenance in some of these sites. And then in other sites, it looked like perhaps trees had been planted originally and they were dead. So you just see their dead sticks sticking up through the cattails. And then it's partly just inference from the data. So if only 15% of species in the regional data set were woody, that includes woody vines like poison ivy or Virginia creeper. So there's still a lot of opportunities for vines or seedlings under the level of mowing. So those are a few of my thoughts.
If there are no more questions, I'd like to thank everybody for your attendance and attention. And we will take a break and organize for our committee meeting in a few minutes.
I wish you were all here to eat snacks with us.
Yeah, we have cookies.
Thank you so much. And to my committee members, I think we'll take about a 5-minute break and then get back on this link. Okay. Thanks, everyone.
Okay, thanks, Kate.
Nice job.
A great job.